All right, Parshas Vayechi. This is the last Parsha, the last Torah portion in the book of Bereshis. So with this Parsha, this Shabbos, we finish the first book of the Torah. And the Parsha starts off with Vayechi Yaakov beretz Mitzrayim Shavasrei Shana, that Yaakov lived in the land of Egypt for 17 years. So if you remember from last time, he told when he went to meet Pharaoh, he said he was 130, and now he is 147 years old, and he feels that he is about to pass away. Yitzchak, for reference, his father Yitzchak lived to 180, and his grandfather Abraham lived to 175. So he lived to 147. And Joseph gets a message that your father is sick. They say the message was sent by his son Ephraim, which is Joseph's younger son, who used to have regular Torah study sessions with Yaakov. So now why is it, okay, your father's sick? That's actually a side note, is that Yaakov specifically prayed that people should get sick before they pass away, because it used to be someone would age and then the death would come suddenly. So Yaakov prayed that there should be a warning, that there should be sickness before death, which it gives us an interesting perspective, just as a general idea. Avram was the one who prayed that people should age physically, that their features should look different as they got older, because Yitzchak, his son, looked exactly like him, so people would confuse them all the time. So Avram prayed that as people grow older, their look should change somewhat. And Yaakov is the one who prayed for sickness before death, so people should have a warning, basically. So Menashe and Ephraim at that time, which is Joseph's sons, they're 25 and 24, and Joseph brings his sons to be blessed by his father before he passes away. Now, Joseph's still the viceroy of Egypt, so Yaakov sits up in deference to Joseph's position when he comes in, and he tells Joseph that your sons are both going to become their own tribes. So they're going to be counted among the Jewish people. Joseph is counted as two tribes. They're counted as the tribes of Ephraim and Menashe. Like when the land is split up, Ephraim and Menashe get portions. It's not Joseph gets a portion, it's Ephraim and Menashe get a portion. And the reason for that is that Joseph to him was considered, even though Reuven is the firstborn of the 12 tribes, but Joseph is the firstborn of his favored wife, of Rachel, and Joseph was to him his heir of the, like, his legacy, like the main one who would be the heir of his legacy. And because of that, the oldest gets 2 portions, right? That's double portion. That's part of the Torah, that the oldest gets 2 portions. So he transferred, per se, this getting of the 2 portions, he transferred it to Joseph and making his 2 sons their own 2 tribes, even though Reuven would still always be called the firstborn. He also, by the way, tells Joseph at that time, by the way, he wants him to swear that he's going to bury him in Maras HaMachpelah, that he will not be buried in Egypt. Lots of different reasons for that, but one of them is that because Yaakov had stopped the famine when he came, he didn't want the Egyptians to turn him into a god. He didn't want to be buried in Egypt. So he made Joseph swear from all the brothers, because Joseph was the viceroy. He actually had the power, to carry this out. And then he explained then, please bury me in Maras HaMachpelah. I know your mother was buried in Beis Lechem. He sort of apologizes for it, and also says, there's going to come a time that she's going to be there to pray for her children, which we went through, when the Jewish people were exiled after the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash, and on the way to Babylon, they stopped and prayed by Rachel, and she prayed for them up on high and was promised that they would be returned to the land of Israel because of her merit. And he kind of says, Yaakov kind of tells Joseph, if your mother had known this, there wasn't a lot of time when she passed away. If she had known this, she would have agreed even to have been buried there. Now, he brings Ephraim and Menashe as 2 sons to be blessed, and the famous thing, Yaakov crosses his arms, even though Menashe is the older one, and Joseph lined them up to be by his right hand, and Ephraim to be by the left hand. He crosses his arms to bless them. And Joseph said, no, you're mixing it up, but put the arms straight again. And he says, no, he too, as in Ephraim, will also become a great tribe. Menashe will be great, but Ephraim also. It's actually interesting, because when they first come in, Yaakov he hesitates and says, who are these people? Because he's seeing some of the descendants that would come from Ephraim and Menashe, and he was seeing some of the not great descendants that were going to come from them. And Joseph's like, no, these are my sons, and don't worry, they're part of the program, they're following your legacy and all that stuff. And that's when, a few lines later, he crosses his arms to bless them, and he says, no, this one will be a great son too, because who would be a descendant of Menashe, not talking about the great people who would come from them. From Menashe would be Gideon. Gideon would come from him, but Joshua was going to come from Ephraim. So that's why he was considered then to be like the greater of them. And he also, in that moment when he switched his hands and put Ephraim before Menashe, he was also setting Ephraim to always be before Menashe, as in when the princes of the tribes would offer sacrifices, so Ephraim would come first. He kind of set the precedence that Ephraim would actually come before Menashe. Now, the blessing that he gave is actually kind of a famous blessing of Hamalach Hagol Osi Miklara, that the angel who always protected me from evil, that God said this angel to always protect me from evil. This way, it's become like a very nice song now. It's sung to baby boys before the bris. It's actually part of the prayer that we say every Friday night. After Havdalah, there's a prayer that said, Vayitin L'cha. The first paragraph is the blessing that Yitzchak gave to Yaakov, that you should get from the fat of land, and God should bless you, and all that you do, etc. And then there's a few more paragraphs that are added. You're actually supposed to say it with somebody else, like out of the same siddur. It's part of the blessing that we're giving this blessing to somebody else at the end of Shabbos. And one of the paragraphs is the Hamal Hagol, which is here the blessing that Yaakov gives to Ephraim and Menashe. He also blesses them that the Jewish people would invoke God's blessings with your names. And when fathers bless their sons, the blessing that's given is Yisimcha Elokim K'Ephraim Menashe. If you've ever seen fathers who bless their children either before Yom Kippur or on Friday nights or candlelight, a lot of people do it at different times. It's Yisimcha Elokim K'Ephraim Menashe. It's Ephraim and Menashe that's mentioned, versus going through all the other 12 tribes or the forefathers or something like that. For the girls, we usually do the blessing of the foremothers, but this specifically, it's Yosef's sons. Yaakov now also assures Yosef that, he tells him, I'm about to die, God will be with you. Also know that God will redeem you. You will be taken out of Egypt. Your family, you guys are not going to be stuck here forever. And also, by the way, because of what you're going to be doing for me now, make sure I'm going to be buried in Israel. And because of everything else, I'm giving you an extra portion. I'm giving you the city of Shechem is going to be yours. Right, that's where Yosef is buried, in the city of Shechem. Now, at that point, he calls for the rest of his sons. He intended, it says he says, I'm going to tell you what the end of days is. Commentaries say at that point he wanted to tell them when Mashiach was going to come. But God, because the wait was going to be so long, and for a few other reasons also, this information was hidden from him right before he was going to say it. Because we see after he says that, he starts talking about other things. So, what happened here? That's what happened here. Now we go into the blessings that he gives to the 12 tribes. And it's a little bit long. We're going to go through it all because it's what the Parsha is. So Reuven, he says, Reuven, you're my firstborn. You were number one. Also, by the way, you're supposed to have, being number one, you're supposed to have the blessings of Malchus, which is kingship. You were going to be the tribe of kings. You're going to have the blessing of Kahuna, as in the priests are going to come for you. But because of that time that you messed up, you don't get it anymore. The mess up is, well, quote unquote, the mess up is after Rachel passed away, Yaakov's set up like his bed. He set up like his main household, I guess you could say, was going to be in Bilhah's tent. So Bilhah, who was the maidservant for Rachel's maidservant, and Reuben was very upset about that. He said, my mother, why should she play? First she was second to her younger sister. Why should she now be second now to the maidservant of the sister? And he moved his father's bed over into his mother's tent, and he was very much rebuked for that, of what he had done, but also he repented for it. So, but even though he repented for it, we see a few times he had times to make certain kinds of decisions, and we see he was not led by the right motivation in some of the decisions that he made. And this is part of why, this is not a display of kinship. This is not a display of someone who would be a priest and needs to have certain kind of patience and this, that, whatever. So that's why it was taken from him. He compares in that he says you're impetuous as running water. Now, Shimon and Levi they weren't exactly blessed, but they were quote unquote blessed together. And he says, the two of you stolen weapons, your partners in crime, and you have stolen weapons were your thing. Stolen weapons because they wiped out the city of Shechem, and weapons is really Esau's domain. And Yaakov is supposed to be the domain of prayer and Torah study. So it's stolen because they took Esau's domain. And he says, I don't want my name to be mentioned with you and your progeny. Actually, in this and in a lot of the blessings to come, Yaakov was actually referencing things that would happen in the future. So in this, where he says, my name shouldn't be mentioned with their progeny, he's talking about a situation that happened with Zimri, which is much later on. That's the one who challenged Moshe with the Moabite woman, which, we'll get there eventually. And also Korach who rebelled against Moshe. So when they're mentioned there, it will say like Korach, the son of Levi, but it doesn't trace the ancestry all the way back to Yaakov there, because Yaakov did not want to be mentioned with these kind of rebellious people. So that's what he says. Also, I'm going to separate you. So Levi does not get a portion in the land. Also because Levi was going to become the tribe of the priests. So you don't get a portion in the land. You guys rather going to be scattered all throughout the land. And Shimon also, a lot of his descendants were going to be like traveling Torah teachers and scholars and stuff like that, and scribes and stuff like that. So I'm going to make sure that you guys don't ever get to band together, because you could cause too much trouble when you're together. It also says like in their anger, they killed a man. And the commentators are like, they didn't kill a man. They wiped out an entire city. But like, that's the point. They were so powerful that it's considered like they killed a man. So instead, they could have just, Shem they killed because he raped his sister. But the fact that they wiped out the rest of the city, they could have just intimidated the rest of the city into subservience or a bunch of other stuff. They didn't have to wipe them all out. He also says your anger should be cursed, which you spoke about then also, is that it's not necessarily the action as much as the anger that led to the action that he curses. The Yaakov curses in that moment. He said, you should have thought this through and not let your anger gotten the best of you. Now Yehuda at that point, Yehuda is now the fourth of the brothers. He's hearing his three older brothers are getting called out. He's like, wait a second, I don't know if I want to be part of this. And Yaakov's like, no, you step up. He thought he was going to be rebuked for what happened with Tamar, that whole story. And Yaakov's like, no, basically you've redeemed yourself, right? You've stood up, you've acted in the way you were supposed to, and you're now going to be blessed with the kingship. And he tells him the blessing he gives him. He says, your brothers are going to praise you. Your hand is going to be on the neck of your enemies. Well, your father's sons are going to bow down to you, right? Because it's going to be the kingship. You're like a young cub and a lion. And even though, you've displayed kingship because when your brothers wanted to kill Yosef, you saved him. Well, Yehuda kind of was the one who made sure that Yosef was sold, but you actually saved his life in doing that. Reuben said throw him into the pit. Yehuda said don't kill him, let's just sell him. And then also in the whole incident that happened with Tamar, where you could have just had her burned and like been done with her, but instead you stepped up and you said, no, I'm the father of the children. You took responsibility for it. These are signs of a king. So that's why you get the scepter is never going to depart from Yehuda. The lawmakers will always be among your descendants, until the coming of Shiloh, which is until the coming of Mashiach. Now, just as a side thing, Reuven did say to throw Yosef in the pit, right? And then Reuven at that point also left because he was the brothers sat down to eat and he was fasting then. What was he fasting for? The whole incident that happened with moving the bed, right? So even though Reuven repented and he was making kind of the right decisions, but Yehuda is the one who actually actively saved people. So it's kind of like Reuven was kind of a little bit too wrapped up in his own the steps that he was taking to also be saving somebody else, versus Yehuda made sure through his actions other people were saved. So that's kind of just the difference there. Yehuda also gets blessed that his portion in the land was going to be a very fertile portion, that it's going to be, you're going to launder your clothes in wine, as in there's going to be so much wine flowing, your teeth are going to be white from milk. Massive, big blessings he got. Okay, then we have Zvulun. He says you're dwelled by the seashores, you're going to be bustling harbors, right? We learned that Zvulun and Yisachar made a pact, that Zvulun would be merchants, they would go and tradesmen and all that kind of stuff, and they would give from their profits to support Yisachar, who would be a tribe of Torah scholars. And through that, they would also gain the merit of the Torah that was studied. And this way they enabled Yisachar to study and not have to engage in business. So that was Zvulun's blessing. And Yisachar, he compares him to like a strong-boned donkey, right? Because you're going to bear the yoke of Torah. That this is to sit and learn and study. It's a hard thing, right? But you're going to bend your shoulder to accept Torah duty, the study of Torah. But also, because they lived on the border, when you're needed for war, they also bend their shoulder then also to send their men to war when it was needed. So that's Yisachar's blessing. Done. It says, done will you'll avenge your people, because Samson came from the tribe of Dan, right? He says you're going to be like a serpent on the road, or a viper on the path that bites the horse's heel so the rider falls over backwards. Which, when Shimshon, if you remember his last moments where he brought down the pillars of the building he was in. So a lot of people died, even though it's not like he directly went and like killed each one of them, but through his actions. So that's kind of like biting the heel of the horse's heels. This is all part of the blessings are the blessings in themselves, and it's also a lot of it is reference to what's to come. That's the commentators tell us about all this. Gad, that's the next tribe. He says your troops will march forth and return on the same tracks, as in without suffering casualties, right? You'll go out and you'll help in the conquering of the land, even though you're going to settle on the other side of the river, but you'll go out and you'll conquer, and your tribe, will be very successful warriors, I guess you could say. Asher, you're going to have very rich food, your land also, and from your land is going to come regal delicacies, king's delicacies. He had a lot of olive trees, so olive oil is considered like a richness. Naphtali, you're swift as a gazelle, and he's going to utter beautiful words, which we'll see in a second what that means, because there's a whole story that happened later when they try to bury Yaakov, which happens soon in the Parsha. We'll get to that. Rashi's the foremost commentator on the Torah, says this actually refers to a valley where the fruit would ripen very quickly in Naphtali's portion. They also say you're swift to battle, because when Devorah and Barak had to call up an army to fight against Sisera, they sent 10,000 men to go fight. And that they're uttering beautiful words. This is the Shiras Devorah, the song that Devorah sang in victory. Yosef, your charming son and charming to the eye, right? The Egyptian girls would go out and stand on the walls to try to get a glimpse of him when he would pass by, because he was so beautiful. He also was said to have the bracha against Ayin Har, like the evil eye. That Yosef had, like, I guess you could say, protection against that. And even though you had your life was embittered, your brothers embittered your life, but God blessed you, and you should have all the blessings that I've been given by my father. You should have all those blessings, and even your blessings have surpassed the ones that I've been given. Should all come to you, etc., etc., etc. And then Benjamin, who's the youngest, he says he compares him to a wolf, like a praying wolf, who in the morning, it says, devours a plunder, and in the evening he splits the spoils. And what it means by that, the morning devouring the plunder, that's a reference, they say, to King Saul. King Saul is the first king of the Jewish people, Shaul. So mourning is in like the first thing, the way he conquered his enemies. He was a great warrior in the beginning of his reign, well, for much of his reign, which wasn't that long, but yeah. And then the way in the evening he'll split the spoils, they say this refers to Mordechai and Esther, who brought down Haman. They were given his whole estate. Now, side note, Binyamin is actually one of, I think, 4 people who the Torah says, the Torah commentators say that he never sinned. He never actually sinned in his life. And the only reason why he died is because since the sin from Adam, in the Garden of Eden, since that sin, this is the rule of life, is that no one gets to live forever anymore, right? That there is death in the world. But Binyamin is one of 4 he was a perfect person who never ever sinned. Another one was Yishai, who's the father of David. The father of King David. Yishai was another one. King David had a son. I think his name was Caleb, not Caleb, something like that. I think he had a son who also never sinned. And I don't remember right now who the 4th one is. Anyways, so after it goes through all the blessings, it says, these are the sons. These are all the 12 sons of Yaakov. And most of the commentators agree that even though Yaakov specified sons for blessings, the blessings were actually were for all of them, and the ones who were specified is just because these are going to be dominant, right? But really, all the sons had all the blessings, right? Because also it seems like some didn't get blessings. So no, they all had blessings, but the ones who were singled out by name is because these are going to be dominant for you. Now at that point, Yaakov says, emphasizes, please bury me in Maras Machpelah. And then it says he drew up his feet, and it doesn't actually use the words that Yaakov. It never says that Yaakov died. Like, it doesn't say at that point Yaakov died, which is where our commentators say Yaakov Avinu lo mes, our father Yaakov never died. It said it. Now, commentators also say that the way that because his children are alive, is in all of his children followed in his teachings, so that's why he is still considered alive. But in the literal text, the Torah never actually says that he died. Like, in these are the years, whatever, Yaakov died. It doesn't actually say that. It just says that he was gathered unto his people. Okay? Now, after that, there were 40 days of embalming. He was embalmed then, 40 days of embalming, and there were 30 days, an extra 30 days of mourning. All the Egyptians mourned him as well. So 70 days he was basically mourned. Part of it, they had a great reverence for him, and also he was the one who stopped the famine. Now Joseph then had to go to Pharaoh to ask permission to fulfill his oath to bury Yaakov in Egypt, and Pharaoh let him because he has to fulfill his oath. And commentaries tell us that he didn't ask him to break his oath, even though he would have preferred for Yaakov to be buried in Egypt, because if you remember, if you're part of it then, part of this chat then, when Yosef first met Paro, right, and they're going through all the different languages, because you're supposed to know all 70 languages of the world, the main 70 languages of the world. So Yosef spoke in Hebrew, and Paro couldn't respond to him. He didn't know Hebrew. And then Paro made him swear to never tell anybody, or else he would have been like usurped as the Pharaoh. So here Pharaoh doesn't say, oh, by the way, you can't fulfill the oath to your father, because he was like, wait a second, if I ask him to break one oath, I don't know who's going to keep this other oath that I need him to keep for me. That's what the commentaries say. Anyway, so he gives him permission to go to bury him in Israel, and there was a massive retinue that went. A lot of the Egyptians were part of the whole retinue, like a lot of big people went, and it was a whole thing. And they say that as they're coming closer to Canaan, well, to Israel, that was Canaan then, a lot of the kings then were like, oh great, the sons of Yaakov are coming to war, right? And then they actually saw that it was actually a funeral procession, and they're like, oh, this great man is died, and they also joined in it. So it was a massive, massive procession that ended up at Parshas Machpelah to bury Yaakov. Now, also Yaakov had told them, only you can carry my coffin, don't let anybody else touch the coffin. And he arranged them. He said, you stand on this side, you stand on this side. He split them up to be like on which direction, which part they should be standing on. It was a whole thing. Now they come to Parshas Machpelah, and Esav is standing there. Much of this is in the commentary, but Esav is standing there, and he's like, no, he doesn't get to go in. The Parshas Machpelah has 4 sections for 4 couples to be buried. So you have Adam and Eve have one section, Avram and Sarah have the second section, Yitzchak and Rivka have the third section, and Yaakov, because Yitzchak and Rivka had 2 sons, that's me and Yaakov, right? And Yaakov already used his section because he buried Leah here. So I get the other section. And the sons are protesting. They're like, no, when you sold your firstborn, right? When you sold everything, you sold this inheritance of the cave. And Esau's like, that never happened. They're like, yes, it is. We even have documentation to prove it. And they're like, okay, where is it? And they're like, oh, great, we left it in Egypt. So they turn, who's going to go get it? Naphtali, swift as a gazelle. Okay, Naphtali, you go back to Egypt and you go get the papers. So Naphtali turns around and has to go back to Egypt to go get the papers. While this is all going on, Dan had a son whose name was Chushim. It's called Chushim. He was very hard of hearing, kind of deaf, almost deaf. And he's not understanding, like, what's all the fuss about? What's all the big deal about? He says, what's going on? Like, oh, Esau's not letting Yaakov be buried. And he said, well, my grandfather's not, what is this? So he takes a club and he smacks Esau upside the head. Well, a little bit harder than that. He basically kills him. There's different commentaries if like the head separated and rolled into the cave or not, but we won't get into that. But that was the end of Esau. And then actually Rivka had a prophecy that her sons would die within days of each other and be buried on the same day. And that was actually the fulfillment. The prophecy is actually fulfilled. Anyways, they bury Yaakov, they return to Egypt. When they get back to Egypt, the brothers send Joseph a message like, oh, remember our father said that you should treat us well, whatever. Didn't exactly happen that way, but they're basically kind of test the waters that now when Yaakov was still alive, Joseph has shown them a lot of extra attention. You're like, don't worry, everything's fine. Like, look, see, there's peace between us. Once Yaakov passed away, he didn't do anything. He still treated them well, but all that extra attention wasn't there anymore. And they wanted to make sure that he wasn't all of a sudden going to, dredge up the past. So Joseph reassures them. He says, God, am I instead of God, right? Remember, everything's happened for a reason. You might have done things that were not supposed to have been done, but everything is still within God's will. Now, because though he wasn't showing them the extra attention, so the behaviors are starting to change a little bit. The brothers the Egyptians also change their treatment of the brothers. It's not specifically negative. It's just because Yaakov's not there anymore, right? And the brothers are kind of secondary to like the 2 big names, right? So it ends up being that the Jewish people kind of just like stay to their section of Goshen. Joseph keeps ruling as the viceroy, but this is where like the first shifts begin, right? Yaakov's not there anymore to be like that joining piece anymore. So this is now where the shifts begin in the treatment of the Jewish people in Egypt, right? And they recognize that we're now at the beginning of what's going to become the Egyptian exile. Now, this Torah portion ends off now with Yosef lives to the age of 110. He lives long enough to see his grandchildren and great-grandchildren the grandchildren of Menashe and Ephraim lives long enough to see them and to raise them and see that, following the program and all that kind of stuff. And then when he passes away, he didn't want to be buried in the land of Israel, and he didn't want to be buried in the land of Egypt. He wanted to be taken out, but the brothers didn't have the clout that he had to take him out. So instead it was like, when you guys, he tells them, you will be redeemed. Pakod Yifkod, God will not forget you here. You will be redeemed from here. And it's the promise that was passed down throughout the generations of the exile. This was passed down throughout the slavery and the generation of the exile, that we will one day be redeemed. When you are redeemed, make sure to get me out of here. In the meantime, the Egyptians sunk his coffin into the Nile River because they were hoping that it would bring a blessing. Anyways, that wraps up. Very, very long this week, but that wraps up Parshas Vayechi. And at this point, if you're in shul, they say chazak, chazak, v'nis chazek. We strengthen, strength to strength. We be strengthened, and now when we start next week, we start a new book of the Torah. We start the book of Shmos, which goes into the Egyptian exile and all the great stuff.